Welcome to this week's episode of the Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Helga Janssen-Daubia, and a special greeting to Michaela Miller, standing by at the Workers' World Labour Show news desk. In this week's show, we continue with our theme of COVID-19 and its impact on various sectors of workers and their communities. This week, we look at the situation of workers in the creative industries, traditionally referred to as arts and culture. How did these cultural workers cope under the severe conditions of COVID-19, especially during lockdown? Have these workers and their industries survived? Joining us to discuss this, we've got Mike van Graan, playwright, producer and coordinator of Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation. Welcome to you, Mike. We're also joined by Malika Ndlovu, globally renowned writer, poet and applied arts practitioner. Welcome, Malika. And finally, we're joined by Yvette Hardy, Director of Theatre for Children and Young People based here in Vrygrond, Cape Town. Welcome to all of you. Mike, let's start with you. Give us an overview of the creative economy in South Africa as opposed to creative industries, the amount of workers and who is actually dependent on this economy.
Thanks very much for having us on, first of all. So when we talk about the creative economy as opposed to the creative industries are part of the creative economy, but the creative economy is obviously much broader than only the creative industries. And where the creative industries idea comes from is very much within the context of, neoliberal kind of economics. It's all about the market kind of prevailing within the sector. So, and it's something that many conservative governments have kind of appropriated over the last while, where they've looked to the market to support the creative arts and artists as opposed to them providing subsidy. But the creative economy is kind of a bit more encompassing in the sense that it does include the not-for-profit sector as well. So I mean, in the same way as when we talk about the education economy or the health economy, we include the private sector as well as the state subsidized sector, as well as, whatever falls in between. So the creative economy is a little bit more encompassing. And so by virtue of that being the case, it is pretty broad. And, it depends again on the definitions that are applied by various researchers and research agencies like the South African Cultural Observatory. So it's very difficult to arrive at a particular figure to say these are the numbers of people who are engaged in the creative economy. And this is our contribution to the GDP, which is also kind of a contested term in terms of determining the health of a society. Is GDP really the ultimate measure of just how economically viable or proficient a particular society is? And I don't necessarily subscribe to that. But these are the terms that traditional kind of researchers use. And just in one of the an article that was written by SACO, which is one of the structures supported by the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture to do the research around these kinds of issues. They were saying that, in terms of their estimate, COVID's impact on the creative economy was 53 billion rand in terms of GDP, the loss to GDP. And that was already last year, about 2 or 3 months into the pandemic. So 16 months later, it's obviously significantly more in terms of the impact on the creative sector in particular, but on the broader kind of social and economic economy in general.
Mike, let me, before you continue, thank you for that. Malika, can we bring you in here? So Mike describes an environment that is a little bit challenging to pin down in the traditional way that we would expect an economy, although in the Western Cape, of course, the film economy is touted as being one of the biggest contributors to the province's GDP coffers. However, Malika, give us a sense of what these cultural activities and the kinds of workers who partake, because let's face it, it's not just someone that's in a soapy, that wears makeup and that is on the cover of all these online entertainment magazines. It's much deeper than that in terms of the kinds of people that make that industry work. Who are they, Malika?
Thanks, Helga. It's such an important conversation because I think you started out by talking about a languaging in relation to what it is that we do as work. And I think what's really a fundamental mind shift is people understanding this labor this professional labor aspect of our work. If you study academically or in any training institution to have an outcome of a qualification, then logically you're entering a world of professional work, which requires adequate remuneration, respect, and shouldn't be, as we're saying now in 2021, something we still need to validate at that basic level. I think the other word that kind of jumps up for me, and of course I'm a wordsmith, so the idea of economy doesn't sit as aptly as the word ecology. And often I think about the ways in which artists operate with a kind of resilience. You know, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Whether we're paid or not, we have to. This is the animal that we are. We have to work. We have to work in order to keep ourselves sane. We have to generate points of connection with those that we engage with as a public. We have to be consistently resourceful, or else we literally can't work. So if the artist is not well, if the artist cannot eat, if the artist can't look after their family, they cannot generate the work that then serves the broader community. And then the other thing about the ecology, it's thinking about this idea of the roots or the tentacles, where our work happens. As you just said, the perception that we operate only in theaters or in theater schools or you know, on TV, in studios, it's shocking that people believe that that's all that we do. You will find artists working as educators, as social workers, as political activists, as academics, you know, in terms of various forms of activism. Where is there a campaign that doesn't involve creativity? And I'm not talking about the kind of, you know, cut and paste or glitzy ad campaign kind of work. Not to dismiss that, great creativity, it's indigenous to all humans. But what I mean is the performing arts, us as writers, as singers, dancers, actors, we're not only working in those spaces, or else we wouldn't survive. So you'll find an actor doing a voiceover or contributing to an academic text, or within a health institution, engaging on how to translate really dense information for a public or for tiers of an organization. I myself, as an applied artist, find myself in the most amazing spaces everywhere, from bereavement work to working with young people, whether that's around education or race or gender issues. And we've always done this. It's also not new. So this idea of invisibilizing the economy and the ecology of what we do is why this conversation is so important.
Thank you for that, Malika. I like this notion of the multitude of work and knowledge creation spaces that an individual artist or creative can inhabit. Yvette, let's bring you into this part of the conversation. The children's theatre, and traditionally children's theatre is hard work, and it is predominantly, I'm sure because of the physicality of it, a lot of young people. How did COVID-19 affect your theatre group and the work that you do in the context of artists needing to earn a living?
Well, it's impacted very deeply on the theatre for young audiences sector, because obviously it hasn't just affected the theatre spaces and the theatre festivals where these artists might have put their work on. It also impacted so directly on the schools and the creches, the kindergartens, the spaces that they would normally be taking their work into. You know, so many of our artists are making work to travel into schools or making workshops that happen within either the in-school curriculum space or in after-school spaces. And essentially, most of that was shut down for much of this last year and a half. Only just very recently, in the last 2 weeks or so, we've had the Department of Basic Education saying that arts and culture activities can now resume in schools. But there are still many schools which are very reluctant to bring outsiders into the school environment, you know, understandably so because of COVID. So there's a lot of resistance still to artists engaging with children or with teachers within the space. So it literally meant that things had to stop in the ways that they had been happening. We were able to do one project in this period, which was an actual on the ground in schools project. It happened in a little window, I think in February, March this year in KZN, where we were able to take a play on asthma into schools in, you know, broader KZN area. And it was fantastic. it was such a relief to be on the ground and to have that kind of live engagement with children and learners and their teachers. But, you know, so much of what we've had to do has had to take other forms. So it's had to go online, it's had to go onto WhatsApp or onto YouTube. It's had to take different forms. So we've done quite a lot of work around creating hard copy activity books so that children can still keep their kind of feeling of play alive.
Allow me just to just interrupt you for a second. So you describe, before we go to the break, you describe a environment that was completely shut down. But how, for your organization and for, you know, in the space that you inhabit, how did that shutdown affect your workers, you know, the creative workers who are in the theatre? Did you have money to pay them? And, you know.
Yeah, it basically meant that many of them had no work, you know, and they were literally out of work for much of this period. We were lucky with certain of our programs. We were able to convince this funder that we could take them online, that we were able to then retain some of our artist facilitators to do that work online. But we were in a very particular situation with funders, and we're a member-based organization. We've got, you know, theatre companies all over the country who are members of Assetage. Most of those were not able to operate during this period at all.
Yvette, we have to go to a break now. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion.
Welcome back. Before we continue, let's get into this week's top stories. The National Union of Public Service and Allied Workers is fighting for recognition at Rhodes University. International Labour Solidarity Committee for Namibian Mine Workers and the lawyer at Namibian New York UN Mission and San Francisco Chinese Consulate. And according to sources, Saudi Arabia plans to deport 800,000 Yemen workers. All this and more, to stay tuned for the full bulletin. Helga is standing by with this week's topic, COVID-19 and its impact on creative industry workers.
Welcome back. Mike, before the break, Yvette gave a description of the coalface, a working theatre company. Suddenly there was lockdown. In your op-ed, your recent op-ed piece, you described the Minister of Arts and Culture as out of touch. Empathy deficient. The monies allocated to arts workers at an average of 699 Rand per beneficiary. Is this a part of the disconnect between sustainable work as an artist, as a creative, as somebody working in this ecology, Malika? Is this just part of the disconnect? It's catching up with us.
I think that, first of all, the first thing to explain to people who are watching this is that people who work within the creative economy, creative ecology, the creative ecosystem, you know, we work very differently to the more traditional sectors of our society. First of all, most people kind of work in an informal sector. Many people are not employed as workers. People are essentially independent contractors, and this is one of the major problems with regard to the protection of workers within our particular sector. Because so many people work as independent contractors, they are excluded from the protections provided by the Labour Relations Act, for example. So when you know, the COVID pandemic took effect and people were able to apply for UIF, many people within the arts and culture sector could not do so because they do not contribute to UIF, and so were excluded from whatever benefits you know, were made available through that particular channel. So I think the first thing we need to bear in mind is that our sector, by definition, is quite a precarious sector. It's what people refer to as the gig economy. You know, when things are available within the gig economy, so people are able to earn money. It's a project by project thing. Very few people get up in the morning and know that at the end of the week or at the end of the month, they're going to get paid a particular salary. So when the going is good, people make hay while the sun shines, as it were. And when it's bad, then, you know, it's really precarious, and it's really been bad for the last 16 months. And that's why people have been so dependent in some way on the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture coming to the party and playing some kind of rescue role. And I think that this is why we've been interrogating the figures provided by the minister at his media event, because there's been lots of criticism of the ministry and of the department. And of course, they've now come out to say this is actually the contribution that they are making. And so the interrogation of the figures was to say, well, actually, you've been trying to bedazzle us with these figures of 643 million rand and 63,000 beneficiaries and the like. But when you interrogate how much money is actually allocated per beneficiary and how long that is supposed to last them, then it shows just how out of touch you are as a person who is responsible for the sector. Because you wouldn't say 8,000 people have benefited, from what we made available, when 8,000 of them have really got food vouchers for 700 Rand from the Solidarity Fund. And when people have had to get money in the first 3 months of the pandemic, and then that had to last them for the balance of the time, who can survive on that amount of money? So this is why it's going to be quite important for organizations and people within the sector to engage with the ministry around these particular things and challenge and present an alternative narrative to the one that he's presenting, basically.
Malika, an alternative narrative. Mike describes, and I mean, we know this, that there are very few social safety nets for people in the creative economy, for creative workers. They don't have the same. You cannot claim UIF. You can't get workman's compensation if you break your leg falling down a ladder as you're putting up a set or whatever. But allow me to play devil's advocate here. This is not just the making of COVID, but it also questions why or how far creative workers have come in terms of organizing themselves as much more than just pressure groups, lobbying groups when the going gets tough, like now, or when royalties don't get paid out, like they've been waiting for the president to sign off on the document. So the question I have is, why are creative workers not organized in the way that mine workers are organized or public health workers are organized?
It's pretty much back to the same point of even what Mike has been talking about, the multiple ways and spaces in which we operate, but also that even the very nature of what we do is, I want to say, even though many of us are transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary artists, it's almost genre specific. So when I listen to Yvette talking about theatre and then children's theatre specifically, that is not necessarily a place that a performance poet is regularly operating in, or a ballerina for that matter. So, I mean, I think that in the actual environments or spaces in which we have historically operated and addressed our own sectors or, subsectors or genres, needs and concerns. Even recently, I was in a Zoom with internationally acclaimed South African musicians, and I kept listening to how this international body was looking at ways in which they could support touring of poets and musicians, and the entire referencing around what we bring and what we need was different. So I do think that just us coming together has happened in multiple ways. There have been organizations that have existed, the various Vanzas and Panzas and Arterial Network, various ways in which structures have come in, even now, obviously Stand and Tada and many others. I'm for the Arts. This is not only COVID specific. These have roots in prior movements of, solidarity, but also activism, trying to embrace the entire sector in a way that it can have a more synergist voice when speaking to the purse holders or to government. But I don't think the listening, as we're speaking about disconnect, the listening is not happening. This pattern of disconnected, inappropriate handouts or strategies that are some kind of rescue mentality in relation to the arts is still a dynamic at play. And this idea that it should be still on the shoulders of the artists to figure out the complexity of this problem, if they're on a bread and butter level, artists are also, I speak from a point of privilege, and I'll say that right up front. I can write a funding proposal. I have access to the internet and a printer and data or Wi-Fi. This is not the majority of the sector. So what exactly are we expecting artists to do if they can't even gather, but also start an organization again, really? You know?
Yvette, I see you
No, no,
shaking
but
your
maybe,
head.
but
Sure,
maybe
Mike,
just come
before
in
we
there
get to
very
Yvette.
quickly,
Mike?
very quickly. Yeah, just to say that, in terms of you're asking why is it that we are not organizing ourselves in a similar way, say, to unions? And again, it goes to the way in which we make our living within the sector. Unions, by virtue of people getting a monthly salary, they get a percentage of that salary allocated to the union, which allows the union to exist, have full-time organizers to basically act on their behalf. In our particular sector, with the precarious nature of people's income, there isn't the capacity to be able to provide a regular kind of contribution to an organization. So when we form organizations, they are incredibly precarious, these organizations as well. I mean, we've launched Theatre and Dance Alliance. We have a Secretary General who has not been paid a cent since we basically launched 4 or 5 months ago. So we don't have the same economy prevailing within the art sector that allows organizations to come into being and to sustain themselves. And precisely because of the role that these organizations play, government is not sympathetic to supporting them. No one wants to support a network or an advocacy network that challenges government. So what government does, and what this particular minister has done, he's created his own sweetheart organization, the Cultural and Creative Industries Federation of South Africa, SIFSA. It's like the Minister of Labor organizing a trade union and say, well, I mean, CASAUT is pretty much a sweetheart kind of organization anyway. But, within the art sector, that's what government has done. They've created a so-called body that's supposed to represent the sector when no one of any kind of value within the sector actually belongs to that particular organization, but they get funded by government and they claim to act on our behalf. So the minister plays a very divide and rule role within the sector as well. And that's something for us to be aware of. But sorry, I just cut in there.
Yvette, Mike, and both Malika describe lots of nuances in the challenge that I put forth about organizing. The children's theatre sector, of course, is a very youthful space. Do you find that there are still young people who want to come in despite the hand-to-mouth existence that might or might not be waiting for them?
Yes, there are. Of course, there are. There are, people for whom it's it's what drives them. It's what gets them up in the morning. But having said that, I mean, it really has been in the last months. It's been an incredibly difficult space to try and make any meaningful difference in. And I think that one of the things that people who work with young people particularly feels that it's that live engagement and the kind of energy that you get back from the children that you're working with that is what's feeding you. And if you don't have that, if you cut off from that and everything's happening on Zoom and WhatsApp in ways which are not, they don't give you the same kind of feedback, I think it has made people feel sometimes disillusioned, sometimes very depressed. I mean, I think we're dealing with a lot of mental health issues at the moment for artists generally, just with a feeling of kind of purposelessness in what they're doing. So really trying to find ways to support people to still feel engaged, to still feel like they can exercise their creativity and that they can make some sort of a meaningful difference wherever they happen to be is a challenge, but it's really important to keep working on.
Thank you for that, Yvette. Don't go away. When we come back, we'll rejoin the conversation about COVID-19 and the arts sector. Welcome back. Malika, during the break, you were wanting to talk about the occupational health hazards and risks. And I want to add the mental health challenges to not only artists as workers, but also to broadly artists as members of society. Did you want to comment?
Pretty much. I think that this is the occupational health hazard, is that we are expected to always be up and shining and delivering and giving. And there's an energy exchange that literally in a financial sense, but also just in terms of our creativity, our soul searching that births these works that are supposed to feed society and assist our collective mental health, our building of cultural legacies, our preservation of historical traditions, all kinds of things that we are supposed to be injecting into, and yet there's a depletion, and even in this context, a depression with the protracted, lockdown. That being said, my first comment was about this catch-22, where to be the animal you are, I have witnessed artists being incredibly resilient already and highly generative, actually, even in this really dark time, out of necessity, out of the fact that the pressure cooker means, okay, I can't do it the way I usually do it. How else can I do it? And I don't only mean online. There have been ways in which collaborations have happened that are really about the circumstance. But the last thing I really want to say is that in many ways, everyone has benefited already and continues to benefit from the creativity of artists, whether it's you listening to music or watching movies or binging on series or starting your online painting class or learning how to do, therapeutic movement. All of that is our work, and so we are doing the work. It's about how to articulate and, in a way, quantify what it is we are doing so that it's protected, supported, but also remunerated adequately for our own survival. And this basic income grant is a very important part of that conversation.
Mike, do you want to weigh in on these emerging movements and moments that are coming through because of COVID? The basic income grant being one of them, and what that could potentially mean for the sustainability and the well-being of creative workers.
Yeah, I think that precisely because of the precarious nature of our sector, a BIG would be a very useful thing. But I wanted to make two other comments related to what Malika and Yvette have been saying. And the first is that although we as a sector obviously are very concerned about the impact of COVID on our particular sector, we are not a sector that exists in a vacuum. We exist within a broader society. And I think there's not much reflection on our part as a sector about our broader role within society that is manifestly, an exhibit of fundamental inequalities in our society. So if we think that we get the short end of the straw as artists within our society, we also operate within a context where quite often what it is that we provide, what it is that we do, are really for elites within our society. It's for people with disposable income. It's with that idea of the creative industries approach. Those who have disposable income are basically the ones that we create work for and that we play to. And I think that this has provided us with a particular time for reflection as well about us as a sector and whom we serve. Who is it that, and it's not to deny that we need to operate and earn money and, pay rent and pay school fees and the like. At the same time, we need to be much more cognizant of who it is that is excluded from the work that we do as a sector. So I think that, yeah.
Continue, Mike, continue.
Yvette, who it is that is excluded from the sector, but the work that your organization and your theatre group do is about building up a new generation of people that can appreciate, so that we can break the stigma of elitism associated with going to the theatre, making a film.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely about trying to give access to, children from the very earliest age, wherever they happen to be, whatever circumstances they may find themselves in. We all have a fundamental right to access the arts. And, we do it naturally as children anyway. That is the way we play, and play is really, the art's just an extension of play, essentially. But that love for play and that natural need for play, which is a part of our learning process, needs to be cultivated. It needs to be supported. And it needs to not be shut down. And unfortunately, what happens in our society so often is that, school and institutions kind of break those natural ways of existing in the world and of experiencing the world using all of our senses, using all of our capacities. And what the arts can do is keep us connected to those things, to keep us connected to different ways of learning and being in the world, and ultimately, assist us to be more whole as human beings. So it is everybody's fundamental right. And our organization is very much about trying to make sure that artists on the ground are able to reach children wherever they happen to be, with content that is going to be meaningful for them and that's going to really engage them and feed them.
I want to bring Malika into this because Malika, that in a sense is once again a challenge, is to build up, and maybe not the language that you like, but a consumer base, a base of consumers who they consume art. So that it's not elitist. And that, in a sense, could potentially be the future role of artists in our society as we build a post-COVID world. Malika?
I think I also think about time in a spiral or a circular way as opposed to a trajectory from the past to the future. One of those is that for me, it's a bit like a remembrance that needs to happen, a recognition of the fact that our stories are with us and are our wealth. And when I say our, I mean everybody. Everybody in society has stories, his inherited traditions, cultural practices that are all part of the dimension of arts and culture. And as Yvette is saying, we're this innate form of impulse to express creatively is everything from how you wear your clothes or decorate your home, to cook your meal, to have a conversation, even parenting. Relationships are constant creative work. So all I'm saying is that it's not this thing that is an exclusive sector of humans have to do. Artists are ordinary human beings that have honed particular strengths or have particular affinities or capacities. But I also feel that it's part of the historical oppression to negate the value of our stories and our identities and our indigenous wealth when we do not recognize that what it is we need to do is not get something from elsewhere, but to be proudly consuming and supporting and regenerating our own indigenous wealth so that it becomes something that's not something you have to go far to get. In other words, talk to your granny. Ask her about the stories of the place she comes from. And if you want to then take that into your school assignment. So for me, it's kind of like joining the dots. Instead of thinking you have to Google an international African-American story about, generational wealth, in the form of story or song. Start local. Recognize that we have been told we are impoverished. And this is part of the mind shift. Imagine if you said, children or young people, anybody for that matter, was told, who said that you're not creative? Let's pull back that veil or that cataract and say, how can creativity serve you where you are? And how are artists expertly doing that because they're in their element? But recognize what this resource is and how it can serve everyone.
How it can serve everyone, Mike, but to be blunt, bums on seats and ticket sales is going to feed you as an artist. How do we, to use something that I think you and Yvette spoke about, break this generational and historical elitism that still controls whose bum is on the seat? Because bums on seats, creating a market, if we want to talk in that language, is what's going to build the sustainability of work in the sector.
It has to do with a fundamental shift in policy. At the moment, we emphasize the supply side. We make money available for productions, for artists to create, and then people go out in search of an audience or a market. And I think that we need to learn from Lula's Brazil, where he basically made vouchers, coupons available to ordinary working class people for them to choose what they wanted to see and then to use those vouchers made available by the state. So imagine a basic income grant to do with the arts for families, where families can basically decide, today I'm going to go to the theater and I'm going to use my 600 Rand from Nati Tetwa to go and see Malika's performance at this particular theater, or I'm going to use it to go and download a CD or something, or to download an MP3. So we need to be looking at you were talking about consumption earlier. How are we going to grow that consumer base unless we are putting economic power in their hands to be able to make the choices and then to educate them about the choices that are available as well. And I want to come back to something which I wanted to continue on a little bit earlier was, if you look at today's Daily Maverick, it's an article by Mark Hayward about his experience at Mahesh Maponia's funeral. Mahesh Maponia, one of the greatest playwrights, died recently, one of the few that the Minister of Condolences actually didn't issue a condolence for, ironically. But what Mark was kind of saying was, what if, as opposed to the Ministry of Health making available 150 million rand to Digital Vibes, they gave it instead to artists to be able to create communication with ordinary people about, COVID-19. And it's a similar kind of thing to what we thought at the time when, because Zana Zuma made available 40 million rand for Bugeni Ngema to do a musical about HIV with people having to come to the theatre to see it. Why not give 1 million rand to 9 different companies, each of them in a different province, to take that story around and educate people, all around that particular province. So it's just that there's a huge disconnect between the people in our country who have power and control over resources on the one hand, and those who have talent and ability to be able to communicate on the other. And there's this huge disconnect. And there, it's just like, it's so depressing, because actually we can be so much further as a sector, not only doing socially engaged work paid for by the state, but using that as a basis for doing other creative work as well, in addition to the socially engaged work that artists will inevitably do anyway.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to come back. Before we have to take a break, but we'll come back in a moment. To you at home, don't go away. We'll continue this very interesting conversation.
Welcome back. You're watching Workers World Labour News. We hope you're keeping safe and warm. I'm Michaela Miller. Thanks for joining us. About 100 workers, all members of the National Union of Public Service and Allied Workers Union at Rhodes University in Makhanda in the Eastern Cape, have embarked on a strike. The institution refuses to recognize the union. NUPSO wants to be granted organizational rights to organize and recruit members to hold meetings on campus and for the university to debit subscription fees. A worker on the NUPSO's steering committee and transformation and a lack of staff development are key problems. In a statement, Rhodes University said that NUPSO does not have sufficient representatives and such does not qualify for the organizational rights afforded to the university's union Nehawu and Ntu. As part of an International Day of Action on August 13th, a rally was held in front of the San Francisco Chinese Consulate in the US to demand the rehiring of the 9 dismissed union leaders of the Namibian Rossin mine. They were illegally fired last September by the Chinese state-owned company to bust the union. Workers were defending their healthcare benefits in the middle of a pandemic and were against an attack on the conditions and employment rights. Speakers talked about the need for international solidarity and also called for an end to the attacks on the Rossin mining union lawyer Hewitt Bucas. Namibian police surrounded his house and shut off the water and electricity, threatening him and his family. There are calls for international solidarity in support of the Rossin and Swakop miners who have been fighting against the union busting campaign by the new owners of their mines. And lastly, Saudi Arabia regime recently announced new regulations on the percentage of foreign workers in private sector establishments in the kingdom. This will mean that over 800,000 Yemen workers will be deported to their war-torn country, with them and their families destitute and starving. The surprising regulations came as a shock for many Yemenis who fled civil war in their own country for a better living in Saudi. Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich countries in the Middle East have a long history of relying on migrant workers from poorer countries such as India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Yemen. The migrant workers are highly exploited, oppressed, and abused and treated like slaves. That's a wrap from the news. If you have any story you'd like to share with us, you can send a WhatsApp message or a voice note to 081 552 4551 or simply send us an email to labour@wwmp.org.za. Helga will now conclude this week's topic of discussion on COVID-19 and its impact on the creative industry workers.
Welcome back, and thanks to Michaela at the Labour Show News Desk. Yvette, I want to just connect to something that Mike said before the break, which was the notion of the Brazilian example of these theatre vouchers. Is that perhaps, and I know that there must be, and hopefully you can tell us, other examples across the world, where getting bums on seats cannot start with a bus ride for a senior citizen to the Baxter. It has to start much sooner than this. So give us some insights as, where to from here to create those audiences.
Yeah, and there are some really great models in terms of this. I mean, the Nordic countries for a number of years have had something called the cultural rucksack, which basically makes every child at every school in the country able to access a wealth of different artistic experiences over the course of a year. In Israel, it's called the cultural basket. And companies, put their work forward to be part of this cultural basket. And then each school is able to select a number of items, being from museums through to music, poetry, theatre, dance, the whole gamut of the arts for their children to see. And I really think that this is a model that we should be implementing here. It should be something which is absolutely fundamental to education. But what I also wanted to say in relation to what Mike was saying is that another area that the arts can play such a significant role is in fact education. Right now if we thought we were in a crisis before in terms of education, we are in a deeper crisis now. We have so many children who have simply not returned to school since the lockdowns have happened. We have huge learning losses. We have children who are stressed, who are demotivated, who believe that they are going to fail. We need the arts for them, for their well-being. We need the arts to reignite their love of learning, their curiosity. We need the arts to give them accessible ways into some of the subjects that they have missed in the time that they've been in this lockdown. So I really believe that artists and the education department should be looking at a really kind of synchronized effort right now to ensure that these children do not lose years of education, which is what's happening at the moment.
Malika, is this potentially what Yvette describes? Is this potentially an opportunity to create work? Because we know that there is very little arts education in public schools. That's gone. What exists are outside NGOs or outside organizations or private teachers who come into the school. But there's no longer that. But is utilizing arts education in school perhaps a way to create work for arts practitioners, but also to support the education deficits as a result of COVID?
The sad thing is that this has been attempted many times before. And the question is, how does it get sustained? Yes, there's COVID impact, but these are ideas that, yes, they stand the test of time. They definitely are a formula in which we do not need to be thinking about reinventing the wheel. You have a captive audience when you work within an educational institution, whether you're talking about tertiary education or primary education and preschool. So everywhere there's this infrastructure and a timetable in which, if we were prioritizing what the arts can actually do and being resourceful and strategic about how we fund those processes, you have multiple beneficiaries. You have also essential training of teachers. I've worked with educators at all these different tiers, and many of them say we were given a subject called arts and culture, but we had no training or empowerment to confidently do anything with these kids. And my entire confidence as an educator took a knock. So I just let them play games. And when the supervisor came, I ticked boxes. And it's a humiliating process, and it does not serve anybody. It also doesn't recognize the missed opportunity, as you say, of the wealth of artists who need work, who could be in partnership with various institutions, not only looking for their corporate gig or trying to get into a theater space. To work in the other thing in terms of market and generative income generation is the same principle of diversifying your product, right? So as a poet, if I only thought that writing and trying to get published was the way that I could earn a living, I would not be here. So in what ways can your particular art form be injected? And we have to teach this. We not only have to do it, but we have to educate, as the hashtag goes, educating because the education is not there at the highest level. There's another level of education that needs to happen to be able to see the how. And we can tell you how to do that. The artists can.
Yeah. Mike?
Again, what Malika describes, an example, not only in the arts, but across the spectrum in society, the disconnect, the policy disconnect. These policies exist, I am sure, in different pockets. There might even be pockets of excellence where the policy implementation has worked, but things just don't seem to talk together. It's a no-brainer. We need arts education in schools. We have a whole army of young people ready to become teachers, but there's a disconnect between the education department and the Department of Arts and Culture. Mike?
Yeah, this morning I was thinking about writing a satirical short story called The Ministry of Missed Opportunities. And it's a phrase that Malika used just now. And I think that this has kind of been the story of the last 27 years. If you think about when yesterday was the 9th anniversary of Marikana, things that simply should not have happened after 1994 have happened. Where we are today as a society is simply not where we should have been, where we thought we would be 27 years ago. And I think it reflects these huge disconnects between a political elite and the ordinary citizens of this country, and those who want to make a real difference versus those who want to basically use access to the public purse as a way of self-enrichment. So I think that it's a really depressing and frustrating time to be in our country as people who are wanting the best for our society at large, because as Malika said, it's actually quite simple what needs to be done. It's all there. There's so much talent, there's so much skill, there's so much goodwill, and there's so much in the way of resources. I mean, our Department of Sport, Arts and Culture has a budget of 4.6 billion rand, So it's not as if there isn't money, it's the way that this money is allocated and used, and not used catalytically in the way that it can be. And we can have very small amounts of resources and do pretty major things with it. And that's one of the things about people who work in the arts sector. It's their passion, it's their commitment, it's their non-fear of hard work that gets them to still be resilient within a sector that isn't a very encouraging one and isn't a very safe one, and yet people remain there and continue to come in. And so I think that it does need to be someone with a magic wand who will eliminate that disconnect, because then
Mike, I'm going to have the magic wand and ask you just to pause as we go to a break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion. Welcome back. Malika, we're going to come to you. Mike left us before the break. He spoke that right now it is one of the most challenging, depressing and sad time. He spoke of in terms of the disconnection in our society between policy and what is needed on the ground. However, COVID, as in all spaces, he's showing us there are also windows of opportunity. For artists and for creatives and for people who work behind the scenes, who build the sets, who put the makeup on, who design the costumes, because it's, what are those moments of opportunity right now?
Well, I think one of them...
Malika gives a sigh, and I know that she's thinking about this. I think I've thrown a challenge at her.
Well, it's also just feeling the gravity of it. If I think about the fact that never before have you had a society that pervasively talks about grief and loss and trauma. Now, this too sounds like, where's the up in the story? Where I have been amazed at the level at which creatives have begun to translate and apply themselves in response to this. Whether it's to say, to reaffirm the importance of human connection, that even if we can't physically gather in the ways we used to, or the spaces we used to operate, how else can we remind each other of the mirror of you in me? Those fundamental amplifications of, look at how this has equalized us. Nobody can escape this. This is nature in charge. This is, collective global vulnerability. So we can also stop navel gazing about the uniqueness of South Africa's situation and actually look at how in many societies, artists are not recognized for the contributions that we make to our overall resilience and well-being. So, I think this thing of the ecology, of basically joining the dots about how multiple spaces that are trying to reinvent, or to sustain themselves, need to return to this base of what are our fundamental points of connection and how can we amplify them? How can we come together in other ways that benefit everyone?
Yvette, how can we come together in other ways? You spoke of the challenges in getting what you do, what your organization does, onto a different kind of platform, onto the technology. Just talk us through what that potentially means in terms of sustainable work for artists in the children's theatre sector, as an example. The challenge of putting things on WhatsApp and YouTube, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as much as disruption is obviously incredibly difficult and, frightening on many levels, disruption is also really healthy. And there is a sense in which we are seeing all kinds of new opportunities. And I believe that this moment is a moment in which we really have some important choices to make. And if we can see the arts as being something which is a fundamental support to education, they are in fact, they're completely aligned. And if we can utilize that young workforce that you were talking about, which is out there, which, as we know, I mean, the youth unemployment stats in our country are absolutely appalling. If we were to look at those two things in collaboration with one another and to say, okay, let's get youth unemployment and education simultaneously, but use an arts-based approach, I think that we have an opportunity here. And I think that there's interest and buy-in from the education department, from some corporate funders, and I think that people are beginning to understand the potential connections. So I think that because the need is so great right now, this is a moment to make change happen. And I think on another level, what has been incredibly positive around this time is the fact that artists have come together in all kinds of ways. Artists have been organizing themselves. Artists have been getting to know one another across all kinds of different boundaries and disciplines and different parts of the sector. They've been working together in very, productive ways to make change happen. We just last 2 weeks had the Charter for the Rights of the Artist, being pronounced, and a whole campaign being launched about that. Just this week, there's been the launch of the Open Theatres Safely campaign. Artists are really engaged in a way that perhaps they haven't been since the end of apartheid, So I think that too is an opportunity. We need to take that very positive energy and we need to make sure that change happens now for the industry across the sector.
Mike, a moment to make change happen is what Yvette said. Is part of that moment a political change in the ministry, and will that definitely be a step in the right direction? I'm giving you the last word on this.
There's always been this debate amongst people, like, if this minister goes, won't they just give us, another person who's not particularly effective? And the truth of the matter is that that's probably the case. But what a change in the ministry does, it allows us a window of opportunity as the arts sector to engage with a new person in that position, to say why she or he should take us seriously and how she or he could have better relationships with the sector. And I think that, what Yvette was saying, there's never been this level of organization within the sector. And so people are now for the first time having their own organizations, their own elected leadership, their own ideas about what things should be looking like, and to engage with a new Minister of Arts and Culture. This one is going to be in a year. He's the longest serving minister. He's been there for 7 or 8 years. Far too long for a minister in that position. His eyes are, his ears are shut. We need a different person to basically engage with. But it goes all the way to the top. Our president has simply not heard anything that the art sector has said to him over the last while. Not a single thing as he kind of responded to. And that, I think, goes to the point that we as a sector are really on our own. And we need to understand that. And obviously, it doesn't mean that we forget about lobbying the political space. We must be there most actively. But at the same time, we need to be looking to our own resources, our own partnerships, our own talents. And I've been very encouraged by what has also happened over the last while, is that people who've kind of worked in parallel situations until now have now come together. So, for example, the Afrikaans festival circuit and the Afrikaans arts community that has been able to sustain themselves through private capital have now come together with others. And so there's a sharing of resources and expertise, which we can now draw upon to take us into the future. Sorry, going on a bit, but
We can absolutely listen to all three of you for a while longer, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our show. Thank you very much to you at home, and thank you to Mike van Graan, Malika Ndlovu, Yvette Hardy for sharing your time with us. Till next time, from me, Helga, and the crew here at the Workers' World Labour Show, have a good evening.